Welcome back to the Advocacy for Protection Outcomes course. This week, in Module 3, we will be exploring the art of persuasion. We'll look at how we can communicate persuasively with stakeholders to achieve positive protection outcomes by identifying some practical and appropriate ways to deliver our protection messages. Persuasive communication is a fundamental skill for effective protection advocacy. It is much more than meetings and the words or the vocabulary we choose. Understanding the art of persuasion helps us learn how to influence others, as well as be more aware of techniques others might use to try and change our perspectives and positions during negotiations. To share with us some insider tips and techniques on how to communicate persuasively, we will hear from Andreas Indergaard on the topic of persuasive communication. Andreas is a special advisor at the Norwegian Centre for Conflict Resolution. He has broad international experience in conflict mediation and humanitarian assistance and has been a political advisor to Kofi Annan. He has worked extensively in Myanmar and other areas of Southeast Asia, including as the UN's senior advisor on Rakhine and the director of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State. Hi, Andreas. Thank you for joining us. I've just been telling our participants that persuasive communication is a core skill in protection advocacy. However, it's always a delicate balancing act when we want to raise sensitive issues with perpetrators, such as protection violations that have been committed. Could you share some techniques that you use when discussing such sensitive topics in advocacy efforts?
I think one of the most important things is to be very well prepared when you go into such a situation. You have to know the topic extremely well. You have to have a sound understanding of the political situation in the area you operate in. And I also think it's important, in particular, when you speak with, let's say, hostile government representatives, maybe those responsible for human rights violations, protection violations, that you also understand fundamentally where they come from, understand the political space they are operating within, understand what kind of orders they're under. If you speak to, for instance, a commander in a particular province, and also try to see whether it's possible to find some kind of overlap between your own agenda and what's possible to do for the actors that you discuss with. This might be very, very difficult. It's absolutely not sure that you'll end up having a positive outcome of the conversation. But to the extent to which you manage to find overlapping interests, I think, in my experience, that you increase the possibility of a possible outcome. But this also has to do a little bit with how you address the violations and how you talk about why it's important to do something about these violations. I think sometimes we become a little bit sort of too attached to our own frameworks, sort of the specific text of the international law, of human rights law, etc., etc. I think it's very useful in such situations if you're able to kind of translate some of these issues, some of these international legal issues, into, let's say, to another language which makes sense to a particular commander, for instance, that you're talking with. Sometimes this can be linked to sort of local cultural concepts. It can be linked to religious concepts. Let me take an example from my time with the UN in Rakhine State in 2018 and 19. So this is obviously an area with huge human rights violations, mainly towards the Rohingya minority, but also towards the Rakhine minority. Most of these violations were carried out by the Myanmar government, more specifically the Myanmar army. What I found in my meetings with representatives of the Myanmar army was that if you only relied on referring to international law, international human rights law, you didn't get very far. It was absolutely crucial, if you wanted to have a positive outcome, to be able to translate some of this sort of legalistic international language that we often use in the UN and in INGOs, translate it into concepts from local culture or even local religion. So if you were able to actually say very much the same, but use pictures, analogies from Buddhist religion, you had a much greater chance of succeeding in the conversation. And another element there, which I found very important, and this is not just true for Myanmar's Rakhine state, but in so many different contexts, is that the moment you start lecturing your counterpart, you almost immediately reduce the chance of having a positive protection outcome of your negotiations. This varies from country to country, but in general, being a foreigner approaching local authorities or even on the central government authorities, if you start a conversation by telling everything which the government has done which is wrong, and you are there as a representative of truth, of the international standard that we should all adhere to, etc., you very, very quickly push your counterpart away. I think it's much better to approach these issues by asking questions, by asking the other person to share his or her experiences in the same situation, and rather let it become sort of a dialogue back and forth, where we gradually try to reach an agreement on something that has to be changed. But the more the other person feels that it's his or her own ideas that this is necessary, this is something we have to change, then you have a much, much bigger chance of actually succeeding with what you're trying to do. And on a sort of more general level, I think lecturing local authorities is almost always a very unproductive entry point. But it's sometimes hard because we're expected to convey very, very hard messages to, for instance, representatives of an army which has carried out human rights violations. We're expected by headquarters to have been very strong on particular human rights issues, but sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to just lecture the counterpart point by point why everything they're doing is wrong. At the end of the day, what matters the most is not that we have been able to call out the authorities on these protection issues. At the end of the day, what matters is, do you manage to get a change in the behavior? You actually manage to change the situation on the ground. If you don't, it doesn't really matter whether you can pat your own shoulder and say, oh, but I told truth to power. I told them what was wrong. That's not so interesting, not so helpful if the situation on the ground remains the same.
The need to be prepared in advocating for protection outcomes and the sensitivity of language, or the interpretation and perception of language used, are reoccurring themes in this course and have been raised by other speakers. I'd like now for us to look at the importance of total listening. This is paying attention to both verbal and non-verbal content when we're trying to decode the real message. A study conducted by the University of California's Professor Albert Merabien found that only 7% of what we mean to say is in the words or the vocabulary we choose to use. Andreas, can you please tell us about the importance of nonverbal communication in negotiations and advocacy, and describe a bit the types of nonverbal communication and some techniques on how to use nonverbal cues effectively?
So obviously this changes a bit from country to country, culture to culture. And it depends also on where you are from yourself. What kind of culture do you bring into the conversation from your end? But I think it's absolutely right. I think so much of what happens in that interaction between yourself and, let's say, a representative of an armed group or a government representative in a government which is hostile perhaps to the activities that you're carrying out yourself, so much of the communication happening in the room would not be said. Much of what is said doesn't necessarily mean exactly what it sounds like. I worked almost 10 years in Southeast Asia, and in the meetings with government officials in Southeast Asia, you very often will get a very polite yes when you request a particular thing, but very often there will be subtle signals, sometimes sent through body language, that this is something only said to sort of finish the meeting, to be polite, to not say no to your face, but it's obvious that this is not going to be carried out. I mean, what you have asked for will not be done afterwards. And one thing is to try very hard to pay attention to all this kind of non-verbal communication that you get during such a meeting, but it's very difficult unless you have a certain understanding of the local culture beforehand. Sometimes it's very difficult if you're parachuted into a country and you meet the local commander in some province to understand these subtle signals that are sent. So, I mean, I cannot highlight enough sort of the importance of local cultural knowledge, local political knowledge, to be, if you want to be able to really decode the message you get. Of course, a lot of non-verbal communication is also on your side. Again, I already highlighted the futility very often of lecturing your counterpart in such negotiations. Sometimes you can almost sort of lecture your counterpart almost with your body language. I mean, it seems that you're oozing criticism, whatever they stand for. You're oozing that you're not understanding the position they're in, that sometimes local commanders may find themselves in an incredibly difficult position, juggling different goals and needs and agendas. And I think there's a lot you can do also with your body language to try to build bridges and try to increase understanding. Some of it has to do with not stressing, not rushing things. Again, this varies from culture to culture. I mean, there are some countries where you're almost expected to just jump into the main issue of the conversation from the very first minute. Other places where that is basically seen as an insult. You have to start with a lengthy conversation about other things, and try to be extremely polite towards local cultural norms. Try to understand where your counterpart is coming from, both through and communicate that clearly, both through your body language and with your words.
You've participated in some challenging negotiations that touch upon protection issues. What do you find is the best approach or strategy when negotiating in high pressure situations?
If you want to have a high likelihood of a positive outcome, the first is actually to take a step back. I mean, it's in the preparation and it's in the way you build up a relationship with a particular party beforehand. Because sometimes it's difficult to just walk straight into a room with a commander you have never seen before and deliver your message and expect an outcome. Quite often, these relationships will have to be built up over time. So that's the first part. The other part is not to rush things. Try to explicitly recognize the paradoxes and dilemmas the particular commander is faced with, and show some understanding for his or her position. And also talk about other things. Talk about his or her family, and not just make it like a token exercise. Demonstrate that you care about this person sitting in front of you, that you see him or her. If you've had these conversations in a previous meetings, remember the details. Show that you remember that the last time you met the commander, he told you that his daughter was sick. Follow up on that. Build that bridge. Make that personal connection. And be persistent. And never jump into the subject matter immediately. At least sort of the subject matter that you think is the most important thing for the conversation, which is not necessarily what your counterpart perceives to be the most important part of the conversation.
So, Andreas, despite good preparation, being respectful to local cultures and attempting to interpret language in a way that makes sense to our interlocutor, at times we may not have control of the discussion. It may go in different tangents and in ways that are unexpected. Do you have any tips on how to control the discussion when negotiating on protection outcomes?
Well, one thing I can say is that I've been in a couple of situations where we have seen the meeting develop in a disastrous way, where we feel that we're approaching a very negative conclusion of the meeting, and there is no way we can actually achieve the positive outcome we came for. And in such situations, in my experience, it's actually better to try to divert the whole conversation into something else. And say, okay, let's revisit the core issue. Let's get back to this in a week's time when things have calmed down, particularly if it's a heated meeting and your counterpart is getting increasingly irritated with what you want to tell. Then channel it over to something else. Try to reschedule another meeting, or try to invite a person for dinner. Try to find another context where you can actually deal with him in a more informal setting and see whether you can gradually start to build up trust again.